Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Suavek Zajac. I work for developer relations here at Research in Motion. All my daily duties involve working with partners and vendors and developing BlackBerry 10 applications. Some of that involves porting existing BlackBerry applications from other platforms, such as iOS, onto BlackBerry 10. So I'm here to share my experiences and discuss some of the things involved in porting applications from iOS. This is meant to be a guide and a starting point, really. This is a huge topic, obviously, and we've just completed our SDK, and we've launched the completed SDK. So we're going to be launching a series of porting guides, making them available online, and obviously we could spend an entire week talking about porting various aspects of iOS applications such as multimedia or gaming or other apps, and we could cover those. But so this is really a generic overview. And feel free to interrupt, ask me any questions, and if I don't know the answer, we'll get back to you after. We're still working on the content here, so let's get started. So first, let's talk about why porting from iOS to BlackBerry 10. Well, the initial answer is obvious. Obviously, there are a lot of great apps on iOS that we would like to see on BlackBerry 10. But more importantly, I guess structurally, there are a lot of similarities in the languages which kind of lend themselves to porting the applications from iOS onto BlackBerry 10. So I'm going to try to highlight the similarities as well as the differences and some of the key concepts in some of the SDK as well as the user interface. So let's talk about the platform design. And obviously that matters because that's where the entire foundation is based on. It's build upon. So let's compare the two platforms side by side. So on the left-hand side is the iOS, and on the right-hand side is BlackBerry 10. And that's how I'm going to run this presentation, so you can always kind of reference iOS on the left-hand side and BlackBerry 10 on the right. So obviously, when we're developing user interfaces, we're going to be using Cocoa Touch UIKIt on iOS, and on BlackBerry 10, we're going to be using Cascades QML for native applications. We're going to discuss other types of applications as well and just kind of overview them. But here in this presentation, I want to focus on native applications. There are other ways to port applications, and we can discuss them at the end. And there are other frameworks which enable porting applications, and there are advantages and disadvantages to both. So we can talk about that a bit later. So let's talk about native applications. So essentially, after the user interface, there are application frameworks on which we need to rely, and these include Maps, iMessage, and there's the equivalent for BlackBerry 10, and we need to map those out and see the corresponding services that exist on both platforms. And naturally, some services exist on one platform and some don't, and we're probably going to get into some of that, but not all of that, and most of that will be listed in the porting guide. Graphics and audio, we're also going to touch upon how to make graphics and audio common and how to port that and what to look forward to when we're porting application and what kind of common libraries we can include. And naturally, there are core services that the operating system provides. When you're an application developer, sometimes you actually don't get that low. Well, if you need to get more information on those, feel free to reach out to me after the session, and we'll try to answer as many questions about that as I can. Just a note about the operating systems themselves. The interesting thing is that they're both Unix-based from the heritage of Unix. So they both have POSIX APIs. So in a way, a lot of the drivers, a lot of the low-level code actually can be ported and ran on both operating systems. If you need to port some low-level libraries, we're going to discuss that as well. So let's talk about the apps. I briefly mentioned we want to focus on only native applications here, but I'll address the other frameworks a bit later. So native applications in the iOS space, you have the native application. So you have your Objective-C Cocoa Touch front end, and then Objective-C at the back end, the client, and potentially when you have games, you have your OpenGL applications. And as well in iOS, you can have the web applications, which are your browser applications, which I don't consider that an application, it's a browser app. And then you have your native application with a web view. So that's where a lot of the frameworks, such as PhoneGap, that's how they're implemented. They're really native applications with a web view. Now, correspondingly, on the native side of BlackBerry 10, you have your QML, Cascades, C and C++ applications. And similarly, you can have games with OpenGL as well. In terms of web applications, we have our native with web view. So similarly to iOS, in Cascades, you can just create a web view. And in that web view, you can have your HTML logic. But we have a different option for you if you're really focused on the web. We have the WebWorks platform, which we were talking about the keynote, and there were many sessions about it here. And that really is, the WebWorks platform enables you to have the native extensions. So it enables you to call native functionality from your applications. So this is where the similarities are. Now, I want to say that obviously we have the Android runtime and the Air runtime as well. If you are interested in those platforms, first let's talk about Air. Air applications can be ported, and you can develop Air applications on iOS, and then you can port them onto BlackBerry 10. So that option exists for you. Now, I'm just going to say that it creates a different application experience. It's not really a native look and feel on both platforms. So you have to consider the pros and cons of that. In terms of the Android runtime, well, it's really not part of this conversation, but yeah, we support that. And I guess iOS, that's a different story. I should mention frameworks such as Marmalade and Accelerator here. So Marmalade allows you to write cross-platform games and applications, which you can then bring over from on iOS onto BlackBerry 10, so you can develop for both platforms. And then you have Accelerator, which I, with an Accelerator evangelist, we presented the preview of the Accelerator platform this morning. And so that's going to be coming into our platform where you can write for both platforms at the same time. And obviously, that's yet another option for you. But let's focus really on the native applications, because essentially, you don't have to rely on other frameworks when you're porting native applications. If you have any questions about these frameworks, feel free to ask me after the presentation. So let's briefly look at the development languages. Now, if you're familiar with iOS, it's going to be pretty basic for you, but we need to kind of address that before we move forward. So user interface development, iOS, you'd use Cocoa Touch framework with UIKIt, and that's really pretty much when you're developing an iOS native application, that's your option, right? You're not going to be developing in another language. Now, the application logic, you kind of have two options here. One is you could do it in Objective-C. The other option is you can actually write your application logic partially in Objective-C, then you can bridge into C++ via Objective-C++. Now, I've seen that as an option. A lot of iOS developers are looking at that, and a little bit later on, I'm going to cover as to why they would be doing that. And I think that that's a pretty good option to go with if you have any open source libraries that you want to bring onto iOS and you want to leverage some of those functionality, and that's a pretty good option to pursue. So just, I guess it's not that legible here on, I don't know how you can read that, but just, C, Objective-C and C and C++ side by side. There's a bit of a learning curve, obviously, when you go into Objective-C from C. It's, there are a lot of similarities. In essence, Objective-C is implemented in C, but it's a different beast altogether. So you have a different way of managing memory and all those things. We're going to try to outline our porting guide. But when you get really into porting applications, one of the key things you're going to be looking at is how to map those objects and how to map the classes from Objective-C onto C and C++ BlackBerry 10 classes. Essentially, the difference is going to be that we're not only going to be mapping these classes from Objective-C to C++, but we're going to be mapping them from Objective-C to Qt classes. And so, as you know, a lot of our framework is based on Qt, and Qt simplifies our user interface development as well as a lot of other interactions. So we're going to be looking at mapping all these classes. And I think really, this is going to be provided to you in the porting guide, but that's kind of the easy part when you just are looking at corresponding classes. You can just reference the documentation and just kind of move forward. And we'll come back to some of that a bit later on. So what about platform services and features? I think and this is one of the key things. We're looking at, for parity, there are certain things that right now you can do on iOS that you can't do on a BlackBerry 10 and vice versa. Obviously, BlackBerry 10 is a whole new platform, and we're going to be releasing certain features post-launch. So let's highlight some of the similarities and differences. Maybe let's start with a simple case here of multimedia. And for some reason, I thought this whole projection is going to be a little bit bigger, and you probably can see the code here. But to invoke, this is not really the point, but to invoke a media player in iOS, it's actually pretty straightforward. And I gave you a side-by-side code equivalent of how you would do something like that in BlackBerry 10. Now, okay, that's fine, but what is the main difference here actually is the fact that you would not invoke a media player in BlackBerry 10 in the viewer. You could, but you would actually use the invoke framework with cards. So if you've attended any of the native sessions, if you haven't, then I guess I can overview some of the cards a little bit. But essentially what that would mean is that the media player would implement a card which you would invoke. So there are certain differences or nuances of the BlackBerry 10 platform which you need to be aware of. So when you're porting these applications, this is one of them. This, the cards is kind of different, and we're going to overview the differences a little bit later. In terms of WebKit, the beauty of porting any HTML assets from iOS onto BlackBerry 10 and vice versa is that, well, the browser is WebKit based. So unlike doing something in, let's say, Windows Mobile or other platforms, you have a lot of commonality, a lot of common components if you're using WebKit CSS specific items, which probably you shouldn't be at this point, but if you are, there's a lot of commonalities, and you can actually bank on some of the common behavior in HTML between the two platforms. So if you invoke your web view on iOS or if you invoke your web view on BlackBerry 10, there's going to be a lot of similarity there in terms of features. Obviously, I think as far as HTML5 support is concerned, we think that we score better on the tests, but for most of the things that you're going to use in your applications, there's parity there. Let's look at the big thing in BlackBerry 10 is obviously push notifications, and that features is also available in iOS. And realistically, for your kind of purposes, implementing these services is pretty much equivalent. We're going to provide you with mapping functions on both the server and the client. The major difference here, I think, is the way push notifications are presented in the UI, and I want to address that near the end of the presentation. Yeah? Yes. So notifications are supported. So all the features that I'm discussing here, all the features that are available online, they should be working right now. If they're not, then obviously it will be a bug. But it should be available on the simulator. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I didn't know they disabled the notifications hub on the dev alpha, but I guess they're trying to surprise the launch. But the simulator should have notifications enabled. So notifications, the way they interact in terms of user interface, but I guess you probably, as a developer, don't really need to be aware of the differences that much, because you're gonna it's more about how the users would interact with them. So this is really the similarities we're talking about. In terms of another big feature that we encourage in BlackBerry 10 is the invocation framework and basically communicating with other applications. And similarly on iOS, you can register your handler for specific content. We have an equivalent invoke manager for which you can do the same. You can specify what MIME type you want to register for, and then an invocation framework where will dispatch the proper application to invoke that. So one of the key things here that I think developers need to be aware of when they're starting is the storage, in particular application sandbox. So both iOS and BlackBerry 10 have an application sandbox. So when you are starting your application development, your application, when it gets installed, it has its own sandbox which it owns, and there are certain kinds of data that get stored in the sandbox. And so I try to map the equivalent between iOS and BlackBerry 10. So on iOS, similarly to BlackBerry 10, in your sandbox, you'd have your application-specific data, so application-specific assets, any images, or XML files, or textures if it's a game. And on BlackBerry 10, that would be the app directory. So for your data, where you're actually writing, not just reading, when you're actually writing your information and storing it, so something that will be available during upgrades. So when you want to store your data, and upon upgrade you want to keep that data, that's going to be stored in the documents directory on iOS and the data directory on BlackBerry 10. And yeah, question?
Yeah, so in BlackBerry 10, applications would still be able to store data on the SD card?
Yes, yes. So you could still store data on the SD card, but that's I guess separate from the application sandbox. It's there will be APIs available for that. And I should also mention that for shared data you have on iOS, it's in the document inbox directory if you want to share different data between different applications. On BlackBerry 10, it's the specific shared directory. And obviously on both platforms you have SQLite, and so this is something that you should seriously look into if you need relational data storage, and a lot of commonality there between interfacing with the database as well. In terms of networking, and I really think that there's pretty much feature parity between the low-level network protocols. I wanted to concentrate here on RESTful web services, just because a lot of applications right now focus on RESTful web services. So it's pretty easy to do it on both platforms. And once again, I apologize. I thought the projector was going to be a little bit larger. So one of the things I should mention here is that obviously there are a lot of libraries which you could use for network communication and other type of like data storage and so on and so forth. One of the neat things is that on iOS, as well as on BlackBerry 10, somebody actually ported the Qt framework onto iOS. So if you want to have a lot of common code there, you could actually use the Qt framework for, let's say, networking and data storage and signals and slot mechanism. You could use that in iOS, and then you can still do your user interface in using Objective-C. And similarly, obviously, we are all based on Qt. A lot of the high-level APIs are Qt-based, so you could do a lot of development that way. So you could get a lot of common code that way. And these slides will be made available. So if you're looking at actually how to implement these various features, I'll make the slides available, and there's going to be a porting guide after the conference that will be made available. Security and cryptography, well, similar features once again, and one of the key differences, I guess, BlackBerry's security heritage is that all the security algorithms are FIPS certified, and so that's this really where all this government being in the government space comes into play, and the fact that they require extra security. But in terms of using these algorithms, they're pretty descriptive, and obviously they're going to be provided in the porting guide as well. One of the key differences that I wanted to outline would be application behavior, and this is where we're going to start getting into some of the differences. So we have different states on BlackBerry 10. When you start your application, you can have your application in a normal active state, and then you can go into your thumbnail state when you minimize the application, and then you can hide the application. So there are certain best practices, obviously, you must adhere to respond to these lifecycle events properly. And on iOS, you get the same equivalent, for not to drain the battery and so on and so forth. But I think the interesting thing here is that when you minimize your application, you have these cards. So these are platform-specific differences. And so you have these application covers here. And this is actually a neat feature to use on BlackBerry 10. And I provided a sample on what you could do when you actually minimize the cover, something specific to BlackBerry 10. You could display active data there. So there's a little timer there, and you can display time, or obviously you would display something interesting. Let's say if you're writing a radio application, you could display what song is currently playing, or something along those lines. You can see the calendar application changes its view to kind of show you the current date, maybe with some meetings. So there's these are the things I think we're going to highlight in the porting guide that you need to be aware of when you're porting these applications. The iOS lifecycle, in terms of your running applications, it's actually pretty similar. One of the key differences right now, which you don't have on BlackBerry 10, is these long-running background tasks, which are headless processes. So this is something that's going to be coming onto BlackBerry 10 platform post-launch, hopefully shortly post-launch, but it's not going to be available at launch. So applications that are running in the background that listen to VoIP messages, or track location, navigation, those will be exposed as we'll have those native RIM applications installed, but you don't have the ability to create a headless process, so that's invisible from the user at this point. Yeah. So yeah, I should specify that applications obviously can run in the background. That's that's all about multitasking and running applications in the background. But when you shut down the application shuts down, right? So you can manually shut your application down, or the system can shut the application down. What I'm talking about here is background running services, so you don't really have the option of shutting it down as a user.
So let me rephrase my question. So if somebody writes a navigation application in a Ruby error, which basically requests location updates and gives navigation prompt, and instead of user killing it, user switches the application from the navigation application to say a browser. So can the system still kill the navigation application
So the system basically will leave the navigation application running, right? Because you haven't killed it manually. Unless your application abuses memory and your system is running out of memory in an unlikely case, then it's going to start looking at that. But only when you kill your application. I'm talking about that use case.
Yeah, so basically, I mean, it's a well-behaved application, but it acquires the power loss to keep the...
That's fine. You can keep it running at all times, yeah. Yeah.
So in that case, it's not really a limitation.
It's not. I'm not saying it's a limitation. It's really a missing feature that will be made available post-launch. In some sense, you want to have that option where you don't want to give the user the control to accidentally kill an application, and they can do that. So let's look at some of the tips on cross-platform design and look at how to leverage some of the commonalities between the platform, because I think when you actually have the option to do so, this is the most pain-free way to move forward. Why? Because it's so much easier to port your applications if you actually have thought about these things ahead of time, and you want to reuse as much code as possible. And design your code in such a way so that it's easy to identify the platform-independent code. So obviously, you want to avoid as much as the platform-independent code and platform-independent functionality as possible, and use some of the common libraries and engines and isolate it. So we're going to discuss some of that. So I already mentioned this before. Just going to briefly skim over this. There's a lot of open source libraries. A lot, right? So when you're doing your application and RIM, when you look at BlackBerry 10 and what it's doing in open source and how many libraries we're porting, you should also look whether the equivalent exists on iOS and try to use them in your iOS applications as well. It's going to save you a lot of hassle, save you a lot of work. And I think it's really an option that a lot of iOS developers are starting to look into, because obviously we live in a multi-platform world. But not only that, a lot of open source libraries are implemented in C and C++, and it's really, a lot of effort has gone into porting them, so why reinvent the wheel sometimes? So, there are certain tutorials on iOS site, as well as we'll provide one in the porting guide of how to actually create those wrappers and how you would go about doing this. So in terms of avoiding platform-independent code, when you're using libraries, so let's say for images or PNG or JPEG, there are a lot of common libraries which you should be using on iOS as well. And a lot of the game developers are actually relying heavily on this feature and or on the ability to do so. So in terms of how would your application look between iOS and BlackBerry 10, obviously we would create common interfaces, UI interfaces as well, and we'd just write our own platform-independent code there. Yeah. I suggest you to use PNG, libPNG. Yeah. DBI4. Oh, well, we'll discuss that. It's coming. Yeah. So yeah. So in terms of resolution, and obviously this is just scratching the surface, because you need dots per inch and everything. And we're gonna be it's right now it's at 351 dots per inch. We are, and iOS is, I believe, at 326. And the aspect ratio is what really matters as well, and the touch areas when you're doing your development. Particularly, I think you will find that the screen sizes between the BlackBerry 10 phone and iOS are very similar in terms of the size, and the touch areas would therefore be very similar. However, we're going to discuss usability and UI and where things differ, and a lot of that will be handled by the frameworks themselves. So when you create a button, the framework is going to size that button for you depending on what screen it's on, and so you should rely on that. So we announced really that we're gonna have two phones, 1280 by 720, and then the BB10 QWERTY 720 by 720, and we're gonna provide the porting guide for actually porting from the all-touch BlackBerry to the keyboard QWERTY BlackBerry. And porting those assets as well. But a lot of that will be handled by our Cascades framework as well. So we encourage you to use the framework when you're doing user interface development, because the controls will be scaled accordingly and they'll be put in the right place. In terms of porting audio, you may have seen during our keynote that some of the games didn't really play the audio. And that actually had to do with the fact that they didn't use OpenAL, and we're going to encourage them to start using OpenAL when porting the game. So this is really very highly recommended for any multimedia, any sound, to start using OpenAL libraries, which are available on both platforms. And so this is really something we encourage, and we're going to comment more on that. Yeah? If you're writing cross-platform, then yes, yeah, because then you create. So essentially, you would create your own kind of interface for playing audio, and if you are thinking cross-platform, OpenAL, it will get you pretty much to all platforms: Android, iOS, and so if you start using, the foundation. Interfaces there, then you're only on that platform, which may be good for you. Well, I'm sure there are pros and cons in both, but I'm not aware, off the top of my head. But we're going to try to kind of list them in the porting guide. Yeah. The 30-second file limitation for? I don't think that is longer the case. I don't think so. Yeah. Okay, so let's get into the one of the most important topics, I think, when porting our applications is the user experience and the UI, and that's really what your users see. And so let's try to focus on some of that. And user experience, kind of, I want to speak to it being different than user interface, because user experience encompasses the whole framework, the whole operating system, and the way your users interact with your applications. So let's look at some of the similarities as well as the differences. So in iOS, and one of the first things you look at when you're actually writing iOS applications, and you have to look at their user experience guidelines. And I encourage you to do so, because I've seen a lot of iOS applications where users don't look at the guidelines. And I think it's very important to have a look at what Apple really wants you to do when you're writing iOS applications. I feel the same about BlackBerry 10 applications. You should look at our user interface guidelines as well. So their key guideline is that users interact with one app at a time. Obviously, there are pros and cons to that, but this is the feeling that you can only do one task at a time, and that's fair. It keeps you focused. So most of the app interaction is based on taps and gestures. Well, this is really strongly encouraged that you should use gestures, not taps. However, I'm looking at most of the iOS applications, and I see a lot of these buttons and a lot of tapping going on. So I see a lot of people are not reading the guidelines that Apple really recommends. So this is something that they definitely recommend. And one of the things that's worth mentioning is the app is a collection of screens through which the user navigates, and a window is always fills the main screen. So I'm going to come back as to why I'm talking about this here. So let's look at some of the common ground here. So Apple says, the first thing in the UX guidelines, display is paramount regardless of its size. Apps respond to gestures, not clicks. And RIM says in its user interface guidelines, content is king and apps must flow. So in a way, these things may sound similar, but I want to explore where things get a little bit different. And so, definitely common ground here is that when we have something like an image, we want to show an image, not buttons that you would use to act on that image. And so how do the platforms enable things and how do they make things different? We're going to explore that. So you've heard a lot about Peek, BlackBerry 10 Peek. There's an equivalent concept on iOS. It's the curl, right? So if you use the device, you can curl the page and you can change an option and you can curl it back. Now, how does that differ between Peek? Because you can think, well, these are kind of similar things. Well, the difference is that this is application specific and Peek really is system or operating system specific. So let's look at some of that. So the key difference in iOS is you have people interact with one application at a time, and RIM wants you to extend and connect and multitask. And so in order to achieve that, in order to enable that, it created Peek, and it created the concept of viewers and cards. So the whole idea is that when you're interacting with a task with a particular task, you should be able to flow between different features and the different aspects of that task without switching the application. So the whole idea of cards was invented with that in mind, that you wouldn't need to launch separate applications. So I want to briefly overview the concept of cards in light of this presentation and just kind of give a preview that this is really something you need to be aware of as a difference between the two operating systems. So cards are meant to enable flow, and we highly encourage flow on BlackBerry 10. So if you're, let's say, a picture previewer application, every application on BlackBerry 10 can create its own card. That card is essentially a way to access features of that application. So another application can come along and say, well, I want to use the picture previewer card, the media previewer card, or another card. So, so cards are really not an application because they don't run in a separate process. But they're also not a viewer, because when you're creating a viewer, you control the viewer's size, you control what's displayed in the viewer, and you control the way the viewer behaves. So in a way, this is the main difference, is that these viewers are application defined, the application that originates the viewer, that defines the viewer, and they're managed by the system. So this is really what enables peeking, and essentially what's the magic behind peeking is, specifying and kind of constraining the cards to behave in a certain way enables peeking, and then you can have these use cases where you interact with applications, and as you have seen during the keynote, you can launch a PDF previewer, then you can go into another email, and then you can go into another application. You can switch back and forth between these cards without really leaving your context. So this is, I think, something really to be aware of when you're coding for these different platforms. It shouldn't really be a huge difference. It shouldn't create too much work for you, because proper applications, BlackBerry 10 will create their own cards. And you, as an application, should also create your own card, because that could be used for many different purposes. One being is that your application could be more discoverable. How so? Well, let's say, for example, if you use the universal hub, or the hub and the universal inbox as it was formerly called, you could have your application in the inbox, and then when the user clicks on your application, instead of invoking the application, you could invoke a card and enable Peek. So you could really promote your application and have it shareable between different users. So you could share links to cards of your application via BBM, and you could view certain content via peeking. So there are certain useful interactions there you could explore. Let's look at some of the tooling, and obviously, if you attended our sessions, we have our Momentics IDE, and then we have our simulator, which is essentially to get our simulator going. It runs in VMware. You get VMware on iOS, it would be VMware Fusion or VMware Player on Windows. You get that installed, then you get the simulator installed in VMware, and then you have the Alpha simulator there. And then our IDE is an Eclipse-based IDE and gives you the QML preview. It gives you debugging, and it comes from QNX, so it obviously gives you really powerful features for profiling and other such things. And there's a lot of documentation about how to use our IDE on the web. But I think the key thing here is, the previewer for QML is really useful. So you can actually quickly type your QML and see what the UI looks like. So on iOS, one of the cool features that I really like is the storyboard creator. So you can, when you're designing your UI, you can create these storyboards. You can see how different screens flow between one another. And so this is, this is something when you're designing your UI application on iOS. This is something that I think is a really cool feature and something that I think we need to look forward to bringing to BlackBerry 10. Yeah? You have no? I thought there were some questions there. Okay, so let's look at a simple project that I've created that I'll be, putting into blog installments as we move forward after BlackBerry 10 to just kind of show you development side by side. And so let's look at how these IDEs work in parallel. Yeah?
Does the BlackBerry IDE support Mac OS now?
Yes. So the BlackBerry IDE runs on Mac OS. So I'm using it, right? And I think going forward, we definitely want to support multi-platform. And the other thing, I'm not really sure if I can announce, but I think I can, is that we're going to support Linux as well. So we, it's really important that we support these platforms. So starting with development tools, it's actually pretty common to, let's say, create a master detail application. So this would be like an equivalent of a settings application. And so in order to create a simple application, there is a wizard that will guide you through it. And so on iOS, it will create you a storyboard. On BlackBerry 10, instead of a storyboard, you're going to get a QML-like view of master detail application. So you're going to be able to browse through the QML, and it's actually pretty well described. It's very descriptive. So QML, in a sense, gives you the ability to provide your QML to the designer. And I think in a way they would be able to understand how your UI is designed, and then obviously in the preview you can see that. I still think storyboards are pretty cool. I guess one of the drawbacks of storyboards, I guess, is that it generates the markup that may be a little bit harder to understand than QML. This is similar to Android. Well, Android still, gives you, from what I understand, I'm not an Android expert, but from what I understand, it gives you the drag and drop capability to actually, with our IDE, you can drag the component, but you don't necessarily, there's no designer, so you can't really kind of align the components. So you can drag and drop, but you have to really specify the layouts in QML. So there's no graphical way to specify the layouts right now at this point. And it's coming. It's just right now you're relying on QML to do that. Yeah?
I think I saw this morning that it supports templates.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So you can create templates, and so, but I think the question was relating to can you actually drag and draw component and kind of resize them and do those kinds of things, and that's something that's not available yet.
Actually, my question is, how this is close to compared to Android. Android, you do layout in XML initially.
How close? I wouldn't be able to. I'm not an Android expert per se, so I own. Yeah. So Apple, really, when you're doing storyboards, it abstracts it for you, right? I guess. Yeah. Sorry, I guess if we were interested in Android comparison, this is something that we're also looking into, and so there will be porting guides. You can reach out to me, and I'll send you the links as soon as they become available. We are working on that. Unfortunately, I am not. I'm not the one. Well, yes. So obviously, Android applications run on BlackBerry as well. We have the Android runtime. I think that's part of a different discussion, though, and where you would use it and what's the advantages, what are the advantages and disadvantages of that. Obviously, we want to promote native applications, not Android applications here. So I think there are huge advantages to writing applications in Cascades and in the native platform rather than writing them in Android and using the runtime. In terms of lists and lists view, obviously, a lot of your applications are going to create lists. I mean, that's one of the basic common features of all applications. I think we have an amazing list view in Cascades, and it's really powerful. And I found when I was doing the application that it's actually much easier to bind to various kinds of data in QML. And using Qt, because the power of Qt, it's got a long pedigree and that kind of thing. So it actually made it very easy to do that. On iOS, I was forced to usingplists, and I found working with plists a little bit more painful than working with JSON or QML files and creating simple bindings to lists that way. So like summary of the short project, just getting into a project on iOS seems like it's it's really easy with the storyboards. When you really get into QML, you also find it's pretty descriptive. But this is really the main difference between the IDEs. In terms of data bindings for simple applications with lists, I found that to be a bit easier in Cascades rather than iOS. By no means is it difficult in iOS. It's just there's a little bit more steps involved and to get that going. So, the simple application, how does it look? Obviously, it's just a simple list with a detail, and it took very little time to implement. One of the key differences here that I want to point out is that you see the action bar here at the bottom on BlackBerry 10, and you see it at the top on iOS. Really, in BlackBerry 10, the intent here is to have one-handed operation for most applications. So one of the things that Cascades gives to you when you use it is that ability and that kind of ergonomics. So that's why it's worth using the native components and native API. If you use the Android runtime, you're kind of stuck running in the Android world on BlackBerry 10. It's a different story. So navigation controller, this is one of your basic building blocks of your application. This is really actually very similar on both platforms. When you compare this to BlackBerry navigation pane, it's kind of the same concept. So you'd find that a lot of the visual UI frameworks, they work the same way. Now, I want to spend the rest of the presentation looking at some of the differences between the UI and some of the similarities. But I see we don't have that much time left. So let's see what I can do in the next 5 minutes and leave some time still for questions. So let's look at the navigation bar, and let's look at some of the main differences here is that I think in the navigation bar and the action bar, you have the custom buttons on iOS at the bottom, and you have the overflow menu. I think the overflow menu is really the main difference. So you don't have to put extra buttons. You can have things in the overflow, and I think that creates I see a lot of iOS developers when they're porting their applications to BlackBerry 10, they're creating these buttons and they're putting these buttons across the screen. And then I see the same on BlackBerry 10. It comes back to our UX designers, and our UX designers kind of give you the advice of putting things in the overflow menu with the action bar. In terms of settings, settings on BlackBerry 10 is a swipe down from the bezel gestures. This is really meant for settings. It shouldn't be used for anything else. If you use it for something else, users will get confused. So on iOS, you could launch the settings application, and that would be, as well, you would go into settings. So This is really, one of the main differences here is that, the settings are available in your application there, and as well you can launch the settings app separately, and then you can peek back out of it. So in terms of tab bar, very similar actually on both platforms. One of the main things that is different is the tab overflow. So let's look at the tab overflows on both platforms. On iOS, you look at when you click on tab overflow, it actually launches a separate screen for you. So you kind of are out of context a little bit. You have all these overflow items on a separate screen. On BlackBerry 10, you have the overflow menu that kind of slides from the right. So the intent here is kind of to keep you still in context. Obviously, there are certain pros and cons to both. You can put more items there in the overflow there. But maybe if you have too many items in the overflow, then you need to rethink your UI. But this is one of the differences here in the UI. In terms of context menu, I think this is another key difference in your user interface. In iOS, the equivalent of a context menu is to really add buttons to the navigation bar. So let's say you are on an image and you want to click on an image, then you can change your buttons on the navigation bar based on your context. In BlackBerry 10, that concept is a bit different in that your context menu is actually a feature of the system that slides from the right. So you can use the context menu, and this is going to be one of the commonly used features on BlackBerry 10. And so when you're porting these applications that use the context menu, this is one of the things you need to be aware of. Now the action bar overflow, again, on iOS, you have the option of actually doing the curl to add different actions for overflow. On BlackBerry 10, you have the overflow menu for your action bars. So these are, this is how you would map these different screens as well. And kind of slowly running out of time here, but really all these things will be available on the porting guide, so you can kind of reference these different screens as you're coding and just make sure that you adhere to both UX differences on both platforms. Action sheets and sheets named in a similar way, and they kind of behave in a similar way. You can have sheets that are full screen on BlackBerry 10, but you can also size them accordingly, and they're really meant for the same purpose, kind of modal pop-ups when you're designing a user interface. And now just to close, one of the key things that I want to mention, what I found when users were porting applications and what actually what got a lot of feedback and negative feedback is obviously iOS was first to the touchscreen paradigm. It has a lot of background there with the way UI should be, and a lot of people kind of reference that as as kind of doctrine that this is the way buttons should work. This is the way controls should work, or this is the way my tab view should look. So what I've seen is that people have told me, well, I want to make my toggle button look the same as does on iOS, or my this button, because these are different schools of thought, but we strongly encourage you to have the same look as what the platform provides. So when you're using Cascades, we encourage you to use Cascades. When you're writing on BlackBerry 10, we encourage you to use BlackBerry 10 controls. When you're obviously when you're writing your iOS application, you want to use iOS controls, and we'll provide you with the mapping of these different controls, but essentially the word here is use the different controls and don't try to make the controls look the same on both platforms. You can, with Cascades, you can create custom controls, and in which case it makes sense maybe when you create your own signature controls for a very specific feature that really identify your application, and there are really neat ways to pursue that. Where you would create a signature control on iOS, and maybe you'd create that own custom control that would look the same for BlackBerry 10, but this should be only saved for your signature controls that are kind of specific to your application, maybe a cool radio dial, maybe some other kind of dial, depends. This is a neat way to identify your application, but by no means should you map, let's say, the calendar view or other things, and I have seen that happen. So I think we're a bit over time, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thanks. Can you have a custom list view? Yes. Yeah. 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 Oh, definitely. Yeah. So the list view component is very rich on BlackBerry 10. So you can, just like the the UI table view that's on iOS, you can customize the hell out of that. You can customize the hell out of a list view as well. And then so that's actually pretty neat. And this is really the building blocks of your applications will be those two components combined with a navigation pane for the most part. And that's how you get started with both. Okay.
With OpenAL, do you have to convert the audio file to the CAP format, or can you just use that as a
I think you have to convert the file. Yeah, yeah.
Do you guys provide the CAP converter?
It's provided, but we don't include it with our open implementation. So we provide the link to it, yeah.
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 Well, for Mac for sure, but I'm not.
Yeah. I think there are issues with MP3 licensing. That's why yeah. Yeah? Question there, yeah? No, you. Yeah.
How about the search part, search control? Any specific control for search?
We have recently added them, so I haven't really mapped them yet, and we do, and it was just like, it was really last minute, we just published the SDK, so we do, and they're going to be published on the, yeah.
Do you have a comparison table on gesture, like tap, how many multiple touch on the phone, tablet? Because I know that iOS is different than other platforms.
Yeah.
They support more touch and gesture.
Yeah, so we're going to do a gesture mapping as part of the porting guide, and the gestures are available in our documentation right now. I guess one of the gestures that is still missing is swipe gesture in Cascades. That's still missing. But other than that, all the other gestures are supported.
How about multiple touch? How many touch?
I believe it's 4 points right now.
4 points?
Yeah,
It's still 4?
yeah.
Okay, not like 5. So you can't play the piano.
Do you press like 5 keys at the same time on the piano?
No, but iPhone support that, so you can actually do 2 hands, right?
Yeah, you could do 2 hands. I'm just saying. I mean, I guess one of the things is don't take my word for it. I believe it's 4, but double check that.
What about tablet?
Playbook is 4 fingers.
Huh?
4 fingers. If you take 4 times.
Yeah, I know Windows is less than iOS, but
Well, BlackBerry 10 is not on the tablet yet, but that's where I get my information is that on the tablet it was 4, and I'm assuming that hasn't changed yet on the phone. Maybe when we release, maybe if in the future they're planning to release a bigger tablet, I don't know, then that would make more sense to do that. On the phone, for
because if there's apps that on iOS you can support that many touch, you want to port over here, so that's why I asked.
yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point. I don't know exactly what the nuances of 4 versus 5 would be and what the actual value of having 5 would be. But, feel free to kind of post a question on the forums, on our BlackBerry forums for these things. And if we feel that there's a sufficient demand for that, we're going to create a feature request and try to add it to the platform. That's how we really...
Major thing for all the musical app, it's very difficult to port over, port out of iOS because it doesn't support, the number of touch you design on iOS.
So, yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point. I'm going to try to bring it up with our product managers for that, just to see, what they think about that, those kinds of applications. I've seen some cool applications come to the playbook, music applications, but it's an interesting point you bring up. Yep. Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you.
How can I get the coding guide?
So it's not published yet.